Mr. Silber.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Silber, and I would like to speak to you about the concerns of a very large sector of building owners, the small property owner, especially for the new people on this board, to recognize how diverse this city is in just building owners, the types of buildings there are, the kinds of owners there are, large corporations, families with many buildings in a portfolio, and then there's the organization that I represent, which is called SPONY, the Small Property Owners of New York. And our owners are individual men and women and families who happen to own a building. And the common thread in our organization is that almost all of our owners live in our buildings. So these are the best kept buildings in New York. These are buildings where we don't have problems with our tenants. We, in fact, live under the same roof with our tenants. We're on a first-name basis with our tenants. There is harmony in our buildings. Everybody is striving for the same purpose, to ensure that we have a beautiful environment to live in. And the small property owner is really the backbone of housing in this city. It runs the fabric of society in every neighborhood. To have sound structures and family-owned buildings is the best thing going for a neighborhood. But our owners are an endangered species, and they're the ones most likely to fall through the cracks when this board doesn't do what it was originally set up to do, which is to compensate. This is a compensation board, to compensate owners for their costs. And when you have an increase like last year of 1%, it is so dangerous, it creates so much danger for the world of the small property owner that we have to convey this to you. Taxes, first of all, are the major expense in all of our buildings, okay? The city is a 1/3 minimum partner in our buildings. They take, according to the price index, 35% of an owner's costs are real estate taxes and water and sewer taxes. We feel that is underestimated, that it's really more like 45% in most of our buildings. But that is a fundamental reality. Every year, the owner has got to pay his real estate taxes. The owner every year has to be compensated for those costs. The city is coming in and taking 1/3 of our income. It has to be reimbursed on the income side. You can't give a 1% increase in rents and then this year see that the city has increased assessments 12.9%. These are real tax dollars that the owner has to spend this coming July. Your board doesn't even consider these increases until next year, but these are real costs that the owner has to pay or the owner doesn't keep his building, and they start in July of this year. So we had a 1% increase, the lowest ever in the Rent Guidelines Board history last year. And what does the city do this year? Comes out with a higher increase for real estate taxes than in the last 10 years. That doesn't make sense. This is not an equitable system when this kind of stuff is going on. And it's the small property owner that suffers through this, because the small property owner, he's between a rock and a hard place. He provides affordable housing. All of his housing is affordable in this city. It's housing that has been occupied for years and years. The small property owner does not get the vacancies that you see in larger buildings because he maintains his building in such excellent condition. People don't want to leave. So he has to be compensated by your yearly rent increases. Otherwise, he doesn't make it. And the system, small property owners say to me, how can a system function where we're subsidizing people in our building, but there's no attempt by government to determine if those people even need the subsidy, and the burden for providing the subsidy falls solely on my shoulders. It's not shared by government. And we've asked for years in the legislature to address this. And in fact, in the budget that was just passed in April, there was a provision to address this inequity. It was the tenant rent exemption provision. and it was created by the New York State Senate. Listen to this. If you earn $50,000 or less, and you spent more than 50% of your income for rent, you would go into this program, the Tenant Rent Exemption Program, which functions like SCREE. You would pay no more rent increases. The owner would get the rent increase back from the city like he does in SCREE. And the New York State Senate set up $34 million in the budget to fund this. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be wonderful for people you deal with? Not one tenant advocacy group supported it. Isn't that awful? Not one, and it died. Just this month, we had a solution to this problem. The legislators don't want to find a solution. They want it to be like it is, and pit owner against tenant. They want the political ramifications of this to help them in their campaigns. And unfortunately, it gets dumped in your laps, and now you have to deal with it. And you come out with one increase that's going to cover all small property owners and all middle-sized owners and all large owners. A person who owns a building on 75th Street and 5th Avenue will get the same increase for his apartment that somebody in a building facing the Cross Bronx Expressway. It's ludicrous. It's a crazy system. But you have to understand that there has been a methodology in this board for the last 45 years, and that is the methodology of rough justice. And that is to ease out the extremes, the high increases and the low increases. And we've seen that. And it's vitally important in a year like this where we have a price index that's only 0.5%, because this has happened before in the rent guidelines history, mainly because of the component of fuel, which is so volatile. That's what dragged the component down this year. But just to illustrate what I'm saying, there are 4 years. 1995, the price index was 0.1%. The board issued a 2% rent increase for a 1 year increase. 1998, the price index was again 0.1%. The board issued a rent increase of 2%. 1999, price index was 0.03%. The board issued a rent increase of 2%. In 2002, the price index was a negative 1.3%. What did the board do? They issued a rent increase of 2%. There was a fundamental acceptance that money had to be coming into this system for it to work. That was always the fundamental reality of this board. And 2%, even during the extreme liberal years of David Dinkins, his administration realized you don't go below 2% because we got to get money into the system. The city is going to come and take 35 to 45% of every building owner's income. We got to put some of that money back. Otherwise, the building's not going to function. It's not going to work. It's simple math. And that's why we ask you this year to consider the history of the Rent Guidelines Board, because I think last year it really got lost in the politics of this administration. And you are, in fact, you're sending a message to small owners. You're sending a message, is there hope in staying in the business of providing housing? Or is this going to be a pattern that's going to be in effect as long as de Blasio is mayor, that 1% is the high end, maybe a rent freeze, maybe a rent rollback. This is dangerous territory you're going into, because small owners fall through the cracks, and if they can't make their real estate taxes and they see there's no future for them to stay in housing, they're going to get out. And you don't replace the small owner with another small owner. You replace them with an absentee owner, and that changes the whole fabric of the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Silber. Go ahead, Helen.
So I was wondering if you were saying something slightly different than what Mr. Freund was saying about the need to treat different types of buildings differently. He seemed to be saying we shouldn't do that, and I wasn't sure. Were you saying that we ought to look differently at different types of buildings?
It's such a crazy system. It's, the more complicated you make it, the more you dissect it's already been dissected so extensively. There's no other private industry that goes through a dissection like this to get increases. But to dissect it further is, I think you don't have the capabilities to do it. I think every market is different in this city. Every borough is different. If you're in Manhattan, it's a totally different rental market. The tenants are totally different. The rent should be different than if you're living on the Cross Bronx Expressway in the Bronx. So ideally, maybe a different rent increase for every borough would be the right way to do it. There's no end to it when you start doing that. And then what's the unit size that you would limit it to? 15 units? We have a lot of people who have 17 units. They're going to be excluded from something you're doing for a 15-unit person? That's not equitable. I think you create more inequities by dissecting further along, like what you're saying.
I guess I'm confused now, because I thought you were saying that we want to keep small property owners in New York City. We don't want these large private equity companies to come in and take over these buildings who are going to destroy and destabilize neighborhoods. And so it sounds like we agree that we want to keep small property owners and, the people who are trying to harass tenants out and evict low-income tenants. We want to stop that from happening. We don't want people to, do illegal rent increases or, these large major capital improvements that really affect low-income tenants or moderate income tenants or working class tenants. So if that's the goal, doesn't it make sense to do some kind of dissection between the people who are the large private equity companies who, the people get arrested last week, was it Israel, the two brothers got arrested who are doing all this illegal construction. Those are the bad guys, and don't we want to distinguish people who are doing the work that you say people in your coalition or organization are doing versus people who are not doing the right thing?
I agree with you. We abhor that type of an owner, and that owner is not good for anyone in this city. He's certainly not good for people in our industry because he gives a bad name to our industry, and the vast majority of owners that I deal with as small property owners don't come close to doing that, okay? But it is not the purview of this board to punish that type of an owner. There are laws in effect that will punish that type of an owner. That owner's been arrested, right, and is probably going to jail. It's not the purview of this board to give a no rent increase to somebody, who owns a building that size, or I don't even know how you would do it, but it's not your job to punish bad owners. It's the law, and the law is effective. Those people have been arrested, and they're going to probably go to jail, which they deserve.
Do you think that people who own a large portion of rent-stabilized apartments in their buildings should have higher increases than people that have less rent-stabilized units in their building? For example, well, I think there is a difference, right? Because if we are talking about making sure we continue to have those communities that you so beautifully described, we need to have all types of people with types of incomes. And I think that if we think about rent-stabilized units as being affordable, and we want to maintain a diverse community, that's one way of looking at it and trying to address the problems that you sort of highlighted. And I'm just asking for your input around that.
Well, I think you've done that. Look at the rent increase for the last 20 years, this board, for a one-year lease. It's averaged 3%. I think you're doing it. You're preserving rent-stabilized units. Rent-stabilized units in the small owner's building don't become available unless the person dies. That's when we get turnover. So we don't experience what you're saying. We experience that people...
That shows that, because I feel like I feel like we have a lot of data around the testimony from tenants, and we hear testimony and we see data. And when you describe that, we don't have the data, so it makes it a little bit harder for us to even have that conversation in a real way, because I'm only hearing you telling me things, and then I hear maybe I feel like 3 or 4 people maybe at different hearings with that testimony. There's no concrete data for me to say, you know, this is how many rent-stabilized units are in small buildings, this is what their expenses look like, this is what in real time it looks like. And I think it's great that you're trying to create, you know, a nice place for people to live in, but I would even ask you, like, if you were willing to answer, how many rent-stabilized units do you have, and what are the average rents in those apartments, to really talk about when we see those numbers around what people pay, if that fits the numbers we're seeing on, with the data that we get.
Well, you have the figures from the income and expense studies. You see what the average rents are in rent-stabilized buildings, and you know that your increases have only been 3% a year on average for the last 20 years. So I don't know where the mystery is.
I feel like we hear from tenants, right? Like, I know tenants who who have an income of yearly income of $25,000, and they come and testify and say, I make $25,000 a year, and I have, you know, a rent that's $1,300. I can clearly see numbers. I can start seeing a picture, painting a picture with the data that we get. And so I'm asking you to do the same with some numbers from, you guys you can tap into, like you mentioned, you have relationships with people that you can get that data and present it to us in a way that's going to move us to have that conversation in a different way, instead of just, we're struggling and we need increases because it's the right thing to do, and your mandate is to make sure that we stay whole, because that's not our mandate. And so, like, when we're having that conversation, I can read that over and over again. I don't get that from reading it ever. And I read it last year in the preliminary vote. I read it in the final vote. I feel like I don't know where what we're seeing differently when I don't see those words compensate. I don't see that in the mandate, and so I don't see you providing data for me in a way that, like, I can say, let's have a conversation about what that can look like. Let's even have I understand that you guys don't want to splice it up, but let's have a conversation that we can even start having, like, really start having a conversation that creates something different. And yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions for the speaker? Okay, thank you, Mr. Silber. Lastly, Jack, do you want to have the last word, so to speak? Yeah, no.
I think we'll be here again next year somehow.
I'm sure you will.
I've submitted testimony. I'd like to submit it for the record. I'm not going to read it. But I would like to address, I think we've covered a lot of territory here in this testimony. I think what we haven't covered is the elephant in the room, which is the political situation we find ourselves in. Last year was really unprecedented. As you know, or you may not know, but there has never been a mayor who has come out publicly and instructed his board on how to vote for a rent guideline. This is supposed to be an independent body, albeit appointed by the mayor, but you have, in my reading, and everybody seems to read the law a little differently, but in my reading of the law, you have an obligation to consider both sides of the equation and come to a compromise solution. Last year, clearly, with the price index of 5.7%, even if that in the revised version is a point lower, it's still a significant increase in operating costs, and this board only approved a 1% increase, and the mayor asked for a 0% increase, and that zero would have been very likely last year and is even more likely this year, since the mayor now has appointed all the members of the board. I can't, obviously you don't know and I don't know, I think you don't know what the mayor will do this year. But regardless, he has made his influence known through his appointees and through his public comments. And the 0% is a very, very dangerous point to put this industry into. I know last year in conversations with the mayor's office, they tried to mollify the real estate industry and say, don't worry about it, it's our one-time 0%, we just need to do this. We're fulfilling a campaign pledge in essence. But I can tell you from experience here that once you do a zero, there's no turning back. If you do a zero when there's no justification for it, there will never be a justification for doing anything but a zero. And what will a zero do? A zero will tell property owners, you don't understand what their cost burdens are, you have no sympathy for them. They will, maybe not in the next day, but over time, because those zeros will continue, or the 1% or maybe the 0.5% will continue for the length of the tenure of this mayor, and owners will begin to disinvest in their buildings. And what happens when they disinvest? Tenants suffer. Okay, again, where we started this from. We want to serve each other. We want our tenants to be happy. We want our owners to make a profit, because that's what this business is about. People are in the business to make a profit. And if they are looking at a political situation where their diagnosis is that we're not going to be able to make a profit, it affects existing owners who are going to, as I say, begin to disinvest in their properties. And it's going to affect the mayor's affordable housing plan, because developers who start to look at this, and they have their models that project out their increase in costs over time, and the models build in a projection of rent increases, which have in the past been based on the 3% average increase that this board has awarded over time. And a zero or an inordinately low guideline just destroys those models. Okay? Either owners are just not going to, developers are just not going to build the housing that the mayor wants, or the mayor is going to have to throw so much subsidy into those projects that will limit how much he can build. But there's going to be consequences if we go that route. So, don't think, because, as Jimmy said, there's been a long-term principle on this, and it's a principle that was actually elucidated by someone who testified earlier this morning, who was a former chairman, former executive director of the Rent Guidelines Board, and the theory was a smoothing one, right? Where he defined the role of the RGB as one of steering a level course of adjustment between the highs and lows of the price index. And that's what we're asking you to do this year, because the price index may be aberrantly low, we think, this year because of fuel, but next year the staff projects 4.7% increase, and that's more like back on course. Over the long term, the price index, depending on how you measure it, depending on the way, between 5 and 6% annual increases in costs. These are huge increases in costs, way above the CPI. That's why rents rise above the CPI, and as Pat has indicated, it's mainly the result of real estate taxes and water and sewer charges, as well as the other costs that keep rising. So I think you need to, take that reality into account and just understand that people are looking at what this board is doing. And you not only set a level of rent adjustment, but you send the signal to the existing housing community and to the investment housing community. And you want that signal to be the right signal, because we need, as Pat indicated, a heck of a lot more housing than we have. Now, we've talked, there's always a lot of discussion about affordability. I don't personally, I don't think it's possible for this board to ensure affordability. There are certainly people, and we it's a question depending on how you measure the people who are overburdened, the people who are rent burdened. There are certainly some, maybe a significant number of people who are overburdened in terms of the rent, but that's not something that you can really affect. Even if you did a zero, that wouldn't improve anybody's housing affordability. We have, as Jimmy mentioned, we have long supported a tenant rent increase exemption program. We think rent subsidies is the way to go, and the mayor is on board. That's why Steve Banks was in our office yesterday trying to sell rent subsidy programs. We may have differences of opinion on how these programs should be structured and so on, but I think there's a clear acknowledgement that the real way to help tenants who have the problem is not high rents, the problem is low incomes. And the way to address that is through a rent subsidy program. Now, there's also been a lot of discussions about a couple of other factors that might drive you to adopting low rents. The concept that owners have somehow been overcompensated in the past, and the concept that owners, that buildings are too profitable, that owners are just raking in money hand over fist. I don't know how you determine that. Let's addressing profitability first. Pat mentioned there is certainly, you certainly have an incomplete picture. In fact, let me just add to Pat's incompleteness of this I&E, income and expense picture. The I&E study excludes 1/3 of the units and 2/3 of the buildings that are out there. I mean, it's an exhaustive study. It's a large sample, but it excludes all the small buildings that Jimmy's organization represents. Those are not in that study. We know those buildings have higher costs, they have lower rents, they have higher operating margins, but those are excluded. So I think you have to consider that. Even the data that we have shows that 10% of buildings are operating in the red, and 30% of buildings are economically marginal. So you have to balance out that 30% of buildings that are economically marginal with the 25% of tenants that may be severely over-rent burdened. And, you're not going to address either of those issues. You're not going to make owners whole, and you're not going to make rents more affordable for tenants who are impoverished. So let's put those extremes to the side and steer a course through the middle, which reflects the increase in costs. Overcompensation, I could see some snickers and smiles going on here when Jimmy was talking about the 2% increases that were raised, that were awarded when the price index was low. Let me just complement that by saying that there have been many other instances when the price index was very high, and the Rent Guideline Board increases didn't even come close to it. And I'm thinking in particular in, for instance, the first year of the Bloomberg administration, when he not only did the regular real estate tax increase, but a mid-year tax increase, and the price index in that year, I think, hovered close to 18%. Maybe it was 17%.
Close to 17.
16.9, there we go. Long memory. But that was a painful experience because we only got a 4% rent increase that year because the chairman at that time said, well, I think that's all that people can afford. All right. Well, that's fine and dandy if you want to minimize the rent increase when the cost increases are huge, but then you've got to compensate somewhere down the line, and that's the situation we're in here today because we didn't get the compensation last year. Now, apparently, the cost increases have abated for this year, and classically, that's an opportunity for catch-up. And that's what we're talking to you about today. So, the other issue that I should just address, because this comes up continuously, and that is, other income. You've got, as Sheila indicated, you've got a building, it may have deregulated units, so you've got this other income coming in. Why should the rent stabilized tenants pay? Well, there's a couple of responses to that. First of all, let me point out that external income is on a downtrend. The number of vacancy decontrolled units has fallen precipitously. I don't know what it'll be this year, but last year was down to about 4,800 units from a high of over 13,000 units. So that decontrol income that's coming in is being reduced. I think you'll see when DHCR testifies and provides you with its data that MCIs took a staggering 50% drop last year. So that source of income is drying up. But even if you took those sources of income into account, it wouldn't justify not granting increases to some buildings just because they have deregulated units. In very many cases, those deregulated units are at market are not getting, the market may be very low. Okay, just to say it's deregulated doesn't mean that you're getting $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month for the unit. The market in the neighborhood may be $1,200 or $1,800. So the building may still be unprofitable even though it has deregulated units. That building may still not be throwing off a profit, and it requires an increase on the stabilized units to help pay for that building. So, deregulation in itself, other sources of income, whether it's commercial income or MCI income, in themselves do not shield you from the necessity of applying across-the-board increase, commensurate across-the-board increase in operating costs. And I'll just finish off talking about profit for a minute, because we always hear about this. I don't know what the numbers are this year, a 31% increase in net operating income over 20 years, which is kind of a figment, which is a misleading number because it boils down to a 1% per year increase in net operating income. Pat has already indicated net operating income is kind of meaningless in itself. It is taken as a proxy for profit. It is not profit. But the bottom line is that this board cannot be in the business of trying to regulate profit in the industry. That's not what this system was created to do. The rent control system, which this system replaced, tried to control profit. They had a very complicated formula in there that gave you a return on your equity. And we know what happened to that system. I mean, it decimated the housing stock. There wasn't a rent increase for 15 years on the rent control. And that's why the rent stabilization system was created in 1969, because the city council realized that you needed a more lenient system in order to provide cash flowing into an aging housing stock to make necessary repairs and improvements. So if you, not only isn't it the purpose and the intent of the rent stabilization system to regulate profit, it really runs counter to what that, what the history of regulation in New York was intended. So I would urge you to, think very seriously before you use that as a justification and tread into those waters of saying, well, owners have been compensated enough or overcompensated or they're making enough money. You just don't have the data to make those judgments, and that, again, takes you into very, very dangerous territory. So I thank you for your attention. I should have initially welcomed the new members of the board. I do so now. We'll be pleased to answer questions, meet with you in the course of this process, and we will, on the part of the RSA, we traditionally provide you with more detailed comments after the preliminary guidelines come out. So we look forward to the opportunity of providing you with very hard data for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions or any comments?
I just had one question. So you talked about the number of vacancy decontrolled apartments going down and the number of MCIs going down for this year, but I'm wondering if that in fact means that the income available from those sources of income has in fact gone down, and couldn't it also be related to the, a kind of a peak as those laws went into effect, as people had the ability to get that? So the relationship between the hard number of those kinds of increases and the total income, I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit more, because I wasn't sure if that was a direct correlation.
I don't know. I can't tell you what that relationship is. What I meant to do was caution you about even looking in that direction in terms of net profit or, operating income. And also to indicate that, the influx of these numbers doesn't have a direct correlation. It doesn't mean because you're getting these increases, the building is better off. Depends on where the building started out from, okay? I mean, if a building is underwater and if somebody comes in, renovates the building, gets MCI increases and so on, that building may be more profitable than it was, but it doesn't mean it's operating in the black either.
Sarah, and then Harvey.
Sorry, just from the owner's perspective, the MCI increases, while it amortizes those costs in the rent, obviously it takes an initial inflow of capital. And so I think it would be really hard to figure out what the correlation is on why these numbers are going down. I can also have a hypothesis that has something to do with the return on investment that's required to be able to justify those improvements. And you just, unfortunately, you can't parse out as much as I'd love to, because I would love to know those numbers as well.
I can tell you, there is a direct relationship in terms of the vacancy decontrolled number. I mean, this trend started in 2011 when the state legislature lifted the thresholds, okay? So there's a pretty direct relationship where owners are now taking a hit in potential income because the rent laws became stricter in 2011. So there's a direct consequence. And again, you know, if this board turns the screws on property, there will be a direct consequence there.
Harvey.
Yeah, I had a question about your 10% of properties in the black and the red, sorry. I'm wondering where you get the number from, because the information we got from the RGB staff was that for the banks that they had a relationship with, there were no units or no buildings that were going into foreclosure. So I'm wondering where this number comes from.
Yeah, it comes from the staff report, and specifically the decile distribution.
Yeah, it's in the income and expense study.
And is that a no?
The number's not as high as 10. I think it's 7-something that are where the expenses exceed income. But in the back, there's also a decile chart that takes a look at, you know, the cost-to-income ratios at different at the deciles, and that's what Jack was referring to.
And has that number changed over the last few years? I don't remember looking at that.
I'd have to take a look back and see where that is. I mean, distressed properties.
I thought they were going down, the number of distressed properties.
Well, the ones that are above, you know, that income is, where expenses are exceeding income, it ticked up slightly this year. It had gone down for 2 or 3 years. But, you know, there are other buildings on the margin, you know, in the decile table that you can take a look at too, you know, where they're you know, they're paying 90%, you know, they're, you know, expanding, they're making, you know, their profit's 10% of the dollar or something, you know, so you could look at that.
Not the problem.
NOI, I'm sorry.
And another quick question, if I could, just around, you mentioned the concerns around real estate taxes. I'm wondering how in your membership, people who take advantage of getting J51, applying for our loan programs through the city, for like participating in loan programs. I'm wondering what percentage of your membership is looking at those programs to have an opportunity to do major capital improvements without having a pass along of MCIs to tenants, and two, you know, looking to use existing government subsidies that are available to them.
Yeah, well, let me just clarify, first of all, that when you do use the J51 program, you have to reduce the amount of your MCI by 50%, so there is a give back for taking advantage of that. Nonetheless, we have quite a number of our members do take advantage of the J51 program exactly because the real estate tax burden is so high that any assistance they can get in cutting back that tax burden, given that they're really sometimes limited in their ability to raise rents in certain neighborhoods. So, you know, that's a valuable program. The other programs that the city used to push are, frankly, they're not pushing as much. The Article 8A loan program, the PLP, I mean, the city does not seem to be very interested in engaging existing owners, the owners of existing rental properties, frankly.
Just one clarification. You mentioned earlier that the tenant community wasn't really supporting the ideas of rent subsidies, and I just would, at least with scree injury, I know the tenant community for years has been talking about, one, extending scree injury at promoting screen injury, and you mentioned another tenant program, which I think, the devil's in the details of every program, but I think the tenant advocacy community would love to champion additional rent subsidy programs that benefit landlords and tenants, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about that, because it benefits everyone. The more ability that tenants get to stay in their buildings and have rent subsidies available to them, the more we're all off as a city. So with our, like I said, we are lobbying now to make screen injury permanent. There's resolutions in the city council. We're talking to Assemblymember Kavanaugh about his legislation. These are things that are important to in the entire city, and we would be happy to figure out ways that we're working collective with you to continue to make the city an affordable.
But if it were more than just making screen injury permanent, in other words, if it were extending it to a broader category, is that something that...
I think I am happy to look at whatever piece of legislation you're talking about, because I don't have it off the top of my head, and things that continue to larger communities. I think we are really open to whatever opportunities are available to us to keep affordable housing. So if you want to send that to me, I'm happy to look at it and talk to other people in our
But
community.
Harvey, in this year's budget, as I mentioned, there was $34 million set aside by the New York State Senate to fund TRE, Tenant Rent Exemption Program.
Yes, you said that earlier.
And it didn't get any support from tenants, and it died. We were so close to having something.
So I hear your representation, and I'm not going to dispute representation. I'm not sure our community would agree with that assessment, but I'm happy to get this information from you. Just because something died April 1st doesn't mean it's dead forever, as we all know how Albany plays. So there are things that we can all look at as a community support. I think we are very happy to do that. I hear your characterization. I'm sure other people will have different characterizations of that, but I think if the goal is to get subsidies available to keep people in their housing, I think we're totally supportive of that goal.
Is this a conversation that you're willing that we could have outside the context of this?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Any other questions?
No, just to
I
clarify.
also just wanted to say something about what you said, Jack, about the board. And I think that for the first time in a really long time, there's actual dialogue across the table where we're really looking at numbers, looking at the data, and like having conversations that I think are definitely meaningful and are different than that have happened in the past. I don't think that anyone sitting around this table, on this side at least, would ever suggest that we would just make across-the-board decisions without ever looking at the data. I think that puts us like sort of in a different, I think that statement is like really hurtful for people's intention on the board, and also like what we want to see as a city. Like no one is going to do that. And I also think that you should, I think that's, the landlord, the owner members are really thoughtful and have really great feedback about how we're looking at the data. And I feel like that conversation is important, and we're having it. I don't think that, as you suggested, that there are numbers that we might already have. I don't think any of that stuff is really like what we're here for. And I think that I commend everyone around the table for the conversations. I really appreciate it, and I hope that it will continue, instead of just assuming that we're going to do whatever it is that you think we will do.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the efforts. I know the staff puts out a lot of numbers, and you diligently look at those numbers and dissect them and analyze them. I think we have a right to come and put our spin on those numbers and tell you what we think is significant and what's not significant, and to encourage you to develop other numbers. There's been the attitude of this board that there can't be too much data over the years, and I agree with that. I encourage you to take up the suggestions that have been made here and that we'll continue to make in order to increase the range of data that's before you. Again, you will come to, there'll be a point where the owner and the tenant sides in this process come up with their proposals, and they won't be the same, and the public members of this board will have to make a decision as to how to, cut the baby, if you will. Let's hope it's not too painful.
Seville.
Thanks. Yeah, just in the spirit of the last few points, if at some point I'd be interested to see if you guys could help provide sort of the panel and maybe Scott and Sarah some more kind of fine-grained examples or data about some of the different types of building types or ownership structures that have been mentioned. So we've got the small owners, we've got the new constructions, we've got buildings that have some mixed stabilized and non-stabilized units. I mean, these are all very different beasts, and at least for me, it'd certainly be helpful to see some data about what the operating sort of economics are of these different types, sort of broken down by type, because it's a little hard to sort of pierce through the overall numbers to see what's really going on.
Do you want to see, and Andrew, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I feel like you have a lot of this information, like when we're looking at PIAC, or if we're looking at INE, or we're looking at really some of the major metrics that we use to make our determination. Do you want to know like what percentage are small buildings, what percentage are large? Do you want to just understand the composition of these?
Yeah, I mean, and this may be something we can discuss more, but at least from right now, especially after the commentary today, I think the two things, one is the composition in the figures we've seen, but also I think it would be helpful to get a sense of like, zooming in on, say, if it's a new construction, what are the revenue streams for that construction? What are the costs kind of that you're seeing sort of looking ahead? And if it's a mixed building where there are some stabilized units and some non-stabilized units, like what's the total income and expenses for that building? And if it's a small building, some of this has been alluded to in the commentary today, and that's helpful to kind of get a sense of the many moving parts. I think where you can put some numbers there and some data, that would be really useful.
Yeah, I think
If I may, Andrew, the capital costs that I referred to, we're talking about NOI, excluding capital costs, DHCR actually collects that and aggregates that. Have you guys ever asked DHCR for that info?
You mean when they put in the costs for an MCI application, this is what? Yeah, that information was asked last year and they gave it to us.
The dollar value?
Yeah, the dollar value, yeah.
And the IAIs?
I don't think the IAIs they could calculate, but the MCIs they could.
They can.
Well, I can't say they could or can't. They didn't.
Okay. No, I can tell you they can.
I'm pretty sure, but maybe they are in there. I have to look.
They collect it every year on the registration, so it's all there. So, and it goes into their system, so they can.
Right, I know the MCI dollar amount.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the
IAIs is
IAIs.
in there, and then actually what was approved is in there too. So
Yeah.
there's those two numbers, and they provided that for like the last 5 years.
So if they already give the MCI piece, and presumably since they collect it, they could be asked for the IAI piece, then you could calculate a capital component.
I'd have to look what they gave us and what we could do.
Okay.
I'm not going to commit without going back.
I'm not asking you to commit, I'm just suggesting that it's a possibility.
It may be possible.
Yeah,
I have to take a look.
The other thing would be useful is if they have data around buildings where, how many units in that building are deregulated over what period of time. That's really important data. And I actually know in my building, like, we do major capital improvements, and no one, even though there's, I think 10 or 12 stabilized units left, the owners of those units don't apply for MCIs just because the cost to do it versus the value to do it. So I don't know how many buildings where there's one rent-stabilized tenant left and they're still doing MCIs, they're just not applying because of the cost of that for the one tenant versus the value. I just don't know, I think every situation is different. It'd be great to know what the basis of the decrease is or in each situation.
Thanks. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you very much for your time. And
Appreciate your time.
good luck to the process.